Thank you for making time today, just after your hearing this morning.
My pleasure.
Lots to discuss. Let's start with General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, this morning started your hearing with an announcement that he's stepping down, has turned in his letter of resignation, and hopes the transition team moves quickly to build a replacement team. So how does the IC, the intelligence community, feel about the incoming administration from your discussions?
Well, first of all, the hearing today was a good opportunity to thank Director Clapper for 6 decades of service to the country. He's done, I think, an extraordinary job. Took a very difficult position as DNI, still a largely unformed office, and I think molded it into something very effective, very unifying within the IC. So I think he really deserves all of our gratitude for that service, as well as the many other years he's contributed to the benefit of the country. I was surprised that he announced that he had just submitted his resignation letter, but the fact that he was turning in his papers was not a surprise at all. In fact, for at least the last year, he has been counting the days. And I'm not sure I've had a conversation with him yet over the past year where he didn't tell me how many days left he had in his tenure. So people shouldn't infer that his resignation was a result of problems with the transition or anything like that. It was prompted only by my saying that I'd heard a rumor that he might stay on a little longer to help with the transition, and I was hoping a little longer meant 4 years. And that's the last thing he probably would ever want to contemplate. But in terms of what the IC's view is going forward and any thoughts or concerns the IC may have, I should probably only speak for myself, but I think that perhaps some of the concerns that I have are not mine alone, either in the parties or within the IC. I think the intelligence community has done an extraordinary job of giving us, on the years that I've been on the committee, very high quality, very professional work product. It's told us things that often we did not want to hear, but things that we needed to know, and it has done so in, I think, a very apolitical fashion. And over the years, I've seen members of our committee, sometimes newer members, sometimes older members, who aren't always clear about what the role of the IC is and think the IC are the policymakers and use the IC to take issue with the administration policy or whatnot. I think the representatives we've had come before us are all very skilled at saying, okay, that's not my job. My job is to give you our best estimate of, okay, this is how our adversaries would respond if we change policy in this direction, or this is what we know about our adversaries' plans and intentions. And then the policymakers, you do with that information what you will.
So that's your polite and diplomatic way of answering President-elect Trump's comments about questioning whether the intelligence community has been getting it right when it comes to things like ISIS.
Yes, I was about to be less diplomatic.
Okay.
So with that context, I think there is substantial concern about, one, whether he respects the process within the IC, two, whether he'll respect the personnel in the IC, particularly if they don't tell him things that he wants to hear. Will he make use of the extraordinary tool and resource that the IC is? And the reason why this is a concern for me is, as Director Clapper yet again confirmed in the hearing today, there is really no question that the Russians were behind the hacking of our institutions and the dumping of documents with an intent to influence the election. Now, we can debate about whether intention was merely to sow discord or whether it was more than that, to try to put their hand on the scales. But there's no doubt about Russian involvement and meddling. And nonetheless, candidate Trump disavowed that knowledge, even though he had been briefed. And I have to presume, although I wasn't present for those briefings, they would have at least given him the top line conclusion that the Russians are involved with this. If he was willing to discard the opinion of the IC and in fact directly contradict it, because it was in his benefit to do so during the campaign, will he act that way as President of the United States when the IC tells him something and he has no credible reason to disbelieve the information from the IC? Will he nonetheless publicly contradict it when it suits his interest? Time alone will tell. But there are, I think, grave concerns about that, as well as who he will pick to run some of the intelligence agencies. As the President-elect has said, only he knows. This does have an apprentice kind of feel to it. Rolling out candidates, maybe yes, maybe no, trying to gin up public anticipation, but only the master showman will display the cards when it's good and ready. But yes, I think there are undoubtedly concerns with every new administration. I think those concerns are probably heightened here.
One of the names that has been rolled out in multiple trial balloons is General Michael Flynn, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, former intelligence chief for the Joint Special Operations Command, among other enterprises. What do you think of him as a national security advisor pick?
Well, a few thoughts. First, I think the service he performed in Afghanistan and working with General McChrystal is to be lauded. I think they were a very effective team together, and I think that was probably among the best service he has provided in his various roles over the years. I do have concern about him as a potential national security advisor, to be candid. Some of the policy positions that he's advocated, a kind of a newfound affinity for the Russians and the Kremlin, concerns me a great deal. Now the president has every right to pick someone who shares that view, because obviously the president-elect has expressed that view. But as someone deeply suspicious of Russian motivations, it concerns me a great deal that he may be getting the president-elect may be getting advice that reinforces his view of Putin and Russia, rather than provides the incoming president with a more sober look at Russia.
And yet, could this be optics? Could General Flynn simply be telling the president-elect that you need to be friendly on the surface, that's the carrot, but we're also going to be building a big stick? Is this part of this new administration's outreach, just like previous administrations reached out to Moscow? I mean, there was a reset under the Obama administration in which there was a lot of warm commentary back and forth. Isn't it just the same thing?
I don't think so. There's a tendency, I think, for all of us, because we want to wish for the best, to read into things, the best possible interpretation. That would be the best possible interpretation. I think the effort to reset relations with Secretary Clinton was a more sober effort to say, can we have a different kind of relationship? There's been a lot of water under the bridge since that time. We've seen a lot more quite clearly about what Putin has in mind that ought to raise alarm bells everywhere in the country, and I think has among both Democrats and Republicans in Congress and elsewhere. So that concerns a great deal. One of the other concerns I have on a policy basis with General Flynn is the op-ed he wrote recently on Turkey, which included the rather astounding statement about Gulen, this cleric in Pennsylvania, that if he were moderate as he claimed, then why would he have excited the antagonism of Erdogan and his government? He couldn't possibly be moderate because the Erdogan government is so concerned about him. Well, the Erdogan government has been jailing moderates and jailing journalists, and that is hardly the test of whether someone is a moderate or a radical. And the fact that General Flynn could be advocating essentially to extradite him to Turkey when Turkey is cracking down on tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who had nothing to do with the coup attempt, without looking at the evidence, a decision that the Justice Department should be making ultimately and independently. The fact that he would be saying this without even looking at the evidence concerns me, that this person would be giving the national security advice. And a final point is the issue of temperament. Ideally, the president, who strikes me as someone with an impulsive personality, ought to have someone who is a stable hand, smoothing out the kind of rough, impetuous edges of the incoming president. And at least the impression I've had, General Flynn, would be that you would have a like personality. And I'll give you an
You mean at the Defense Intelligence Agency, when you, on the House Intelligence Committee would have been dealing with him in testimony and closed hearings?
Well, I'll give a more recent, I'll give a more recent illustration. I was dragooned into service on the Benghazi Select Committee, and there were a lot of allegations that the administration had politicized the intelligence, and this transcript of the interview that we did with General Flynn is public, and I raised the issue with him about politicization of intelligence. He was the head of DIA at the time of the attack in Benghazi. And I said, he has made a lot of suggestions condemnatory of the secretary and of Susan Rice, that they were politicizing the intelligence, but some of the intelligence we were gathering was from DIA. And some of that intelligence was suggestive that what happened in Benghazi began as a protest. And I assumed that he hadn't been politicizing the intelligence of his analysts, and of course he said he hadn't. And I asked him then how to explain the fact that some of their own analysis suggested quite erroneously that what happened in Benghazi began as a protest. And his answer was it did begin as a protest. And I have to say it left us all quite flabbergasted, Democrats and Republicans, that he was saying at this late stage that he believed that began as a protest. And it signaled to me that he either hadn't done his homework or wasn't very well prepared or was prepared to shoot from the hip. And it would concern me to have an advisor who was not well prepared, that is prepared to shoot from the hip. And I would prefer to see someone, and obviously it's the president's judgment for that position, it won't be subject to confirmation. But I would like to see someone with very sober judgment, with a temperament that complements rather than accentuates the eccentricities of the incoming president.
So with that, I'm sorry that General Flynn is not available to answer some of that, but I'm sure we'll be hearing from him soon in a larger context. Let's pivot to the big questions facing this country in terms of our international security, the ongoing crisis in Syria, the fight against ISIS in Mosul that seems to be going better inside Iraq. What would happen, say ISIS is driven out of Mosul, what kind of U.S. commitment does Iraq need to keep ISIS out?
I think the commitment they need from us and where I think we can add the most valuable, although it's a really tough job that we have not made much progress on, and that is trying to help the Iraqis deal with the political problems that gave rise to al-Qaeda in Iraq and allowed its transmogrification ultimately into ISIS, that the Sunnis still don't feel a part of the security infrastructure, they don't feel a part of the political infrastructure. They're still wondering whether they have a role in this Iraq that they used to control through their Ba'athist leader. And until that alienation of the Sunni community is addressed politically, ISIS will be largely expelled, not completely, but it will be largely expelled and significantly suppressed, as was al-Qaeda in Iraq, but we will remain in grave danger of a resurrection. So the help with that political problem is probably the biggest value we can add. We can also add value in terms of making sure that Iraq remains independent of Iran. Those two problems are interconnected.
And is that by maintaining some sort of U.S. troop presence if the Iraqi government approves? Because I remember hearing from intelligence professionals, including CIA folks, that our precipitous drawdown of troops, in their eyes, under the Obama administration, resulted in an intelligence black eye. They said they had to pull out a lot of assets very quickly. They didn't even have time or preparation to turn some of them over to their Iraqi counterparts. So not only did the U.S. lose an intelligence feed from that area, but our Iraqi allies also lost capability to watch militancy.
I think it's certainly true that one of the benefits of having a military footprint anywhere is it also gives us an intelligence footprint. And when we have discussions about what our appropriate troop levels are in Iraq or in Afghanistan, part and parcel of that discussion is what will the impact be on the IC. Because we need some kind of a security framework often to have an intelligence presence. And As the military footprint diminishes, so does the intelligence as well. And undoubtedly, that was an impact of drawing down in Iraq. Can we let the intelligence impact be the sole driver of the size of our military commitment? I don't think we can. Is it a factor? Yes. Should it be a factor? Yes. There are a lot of other factors too, though, including whether the host government wants us there, whether the host government will protect our troops that are there, and all that is ultimately weighed in the balance. So ideally, we'll have an Iraq government in the future that would like to have an American presence there. And we'll have a sufficient presence there that we can gain good intelligence to at least see early indicators if there's going to be a subsequent iteration of ISIS. But I think the preeminent area where we can add value is in using what leverage we have, which is not unlimited, to force the Iraqis to make the political hard decisions necessary to keep that country together. And prevent a reemergence of another extreme form of Sunni radicalism.
So let's pivot to a much tougher question. Inside Syria, President-elect Trump has said that he's perhaps not inclined to continue to support Syrian rebels, including some of those rebel groups inside places like Aleppo, who have been supported by the U.S., mostly covertly, but have also made battlefield alliances with Al-Qaeda offshoots or al-Nusra offshoots. So what would happen if a Trump administration works with Russia to come to a solution that allows Bashar Assad to stay in power?
Well, I think it means that the civil war churns on. And I think one of the preeminent impacts of the Russian engagement has been it diminished any incentive for Assad to come to the bargaining table and gave Assad the view that he can win this militarily. And with the heavy Russian involvement, with the heavy Iranian involvement, the trend lines are all favoring the regime. But nonetheless, as long as Assad is in power, that war will go on. Now, it may take the form of a large-scale guerrilla insurgency rather than an opposition that holds large swaths of the country. But nonetheless, that conflict is going to churn on. There won't be a negotiated outcome that will be acceptable to the opposition. So it concerns me gravely, both because I think it means the suffering in Syria goes on. I think it means that those that we support will feel betrayed. I think there'll be reputational costs to the United States as well, and I think it will further aggrandize the Iranians and the Russians.
Do you think that those that we are supporting now, not the Syrian Defense Forces that are in the east of the country helping fight ISIS and drive them out of Raqqa, but the ones closer to the coast, do you think that they might join Al-Qaeda and strengthen the Al-Qaeda related movement?
Well, the military program is the only one I can discuss, but I can say that...
well, we all know there are rebels in Aleppo, so not talking about who's funding them on the U.S. side, just talking about them in general.
Well, I can say that, for years now, I think it's been clear that the day after the fight with ISIS was over in Syria, we were going to have a new and big, and in some respects, more difficult challenge in the fight against Al-Qaeda in Syria, because Al-Qaeda is a far more indigenous force than ISIS, which has been predominantly foreign fighters in Syria. I do think that any diminution in support for the moderate opposition to the regime will mean of necessity that they move closer to Al-Qaeda in Syria as a matter of survival. And they'll also feel betrayed, and that the only ones that are really fighting with them are these extremist groups like Al-Qaeda.
Does that sense of betrayal also apply to members of the U.S. intelligence community who've helped in this fight and talked these people into supporting the U.S. position?
Again, that's not a question that I can answer.
I had to try.
You had to try. You know, one of the many travesties of this horrible war, with its just unfathomable human consequences, has been what Bashar Assad set out to do in the beginning of this war. He has largely accomplished, which is he always wanted this to be a fight between he and the terrorists. And for years, of course, he trained all of his fire on the moderate opposition, feeling that they were the real threat to him because they would have the support of powers around the world. But if he could turn this into a choice, a binary choice between he and the extremists, that was something he could survive. And to the degree that the moderates have been wiped out and are continuing to be wiped out, he is turning this into a choice between he and the extremists. And
does the Obama administration bear some responsibility in that its approach to Syria has been incrementally stepping up military support?
You know, the current administration does bear some responsibility. And, you know, the challenge, I think, both for the administration and critics of the administration on its Syria policy is it has been very hard to define what would have yielded a better outcome. You can look at the Syrian conflict along pretty much every stage of that conflict, and it's not clear what different approach would have yielded a better result. You know, the biggest crossroads that people point to, of course, is the drawing of the red line and the failure to follow through on the red line.
Though they did use that to talk Syria into giving up its strategic reserve of its WMD. So.
Well, exactly. And, you know, I think for those that take strongest issue with that chapter and the history of the war, you know, it is entirely plausible that had we gone through with the kind of precision or pinprick strikes that were being contemplated, it would not have changed the direction of the war at all, but you would have had the same war with a lot more chemical weapons. Now, we have seen that not all the chemical weapons were given up by Syria, and some have been acquired by ISIS. The regime has also moved to chlorine weapons. But nonetheless, at practically every point, you can also point out how the consequences might be equally dire with a different alternative. There have been those that have advocated much stronger support of the rebels. Some have advocated man pads for the rebels. You can imagine what the consequences would be if they started downing civilian airliners with those. This has, I think, for probably anyone in the national security arena, been the most difficult intertwined problem. And while the administration, this will be probably the darkest chapter and the hardest case for the administration in terms of its legacy, the critics don't have an easy answer for it either.
Does the new administration and the incoming Congress give you an opportunity to finally pass a new authorization for the use of military force against ISIS, which I know has been one of your projects for a long time?
It does give us that opportunity.
And do you need to, with an administration that seems to be talking very expansively about its use of executive power? Well,
it's interesting. As you mentioned, I've been involved in this issue for a couple years now, aggressively pushing for a new authorization. And when it looked like it was going to be a Clinton-Kaine administration, the prospects of achieving a new AOMF, I think, were considerably brighter because Tim Kaine was my Senate counterpart in the fight to take up an AOMF, so we would have had a great champion of that in the White House. Still would not have been easy or a done deal, but that would have been enormously facilitated by his position there. There are some factors with the Trump administration that may also facilitate movement on an AOMF, and for the reason that many of my GOP colleagues may now find they have ample reason to support a new, more limited AOMF than they did before they knew who the occupant of the Oval Office was. The main GOP opposition has been not wanting to constrain the hands of the next president. I don't think that was a position they took knowing that Donald Trump would be the next president. Now, whether that changes minds or not, I think it may gather a few more supporters in the GOP for the idea of a new AMF. The problem, though, will remain, and that is there's not a lot of incentive in the White House to push or use political capital for the heavy fight that an AMF would be, because it will inherently provide a limitation on executive power, which no president seems to want. President Obama has wanted it as an intellectual matter, hasn't wanted it enough to use his political capital to get it done. And I think the president's view, not unjustifiably, has been, I can't want this more than the Congress. It's their institutional responsibility to declare war, and if the members of Congress don't care about this that much, why should I be the one to push harder than they are? So there'll be another relook at this, but the congressional, I wouldn't say unwillingness, but apathy about taking a hard vote will remain, and the administration not necessarily wanting to use its political capital to limit its own power, that problem will remain. So I have to say I'm not all that optimistic.
So in the time we have left, to look at some larger geopolitical issues, and again in the context of the new administration, President-elect Trump has talked about growing the military, and some of his advisors and surrogates have said that could send a message to check Russian expansionism, Chinese expansionism, Iranian meddling. But he's also talked about shrinking the troop presence in places like Asia. So what do you see as the way to thread that needle? Like, could a larger military and more aggressive deployments help check some of these countries?
Well, yes. I think, for example, vigorous freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea will be very important. Trying to cultivate relationships in that region will be very important. We were dealt a very serious setback, I think, in the Philippines with their new president, who's taken an abrupt turn from 50 years or more in the U.S.-Philippines relationship. But I think a stronger U.S.-NATO presence in the Baltics and Eastern Europe will be important. So I think all those things could contribute to pushing back on some of the very aggressive Chinese moves. They're going to have to be part of a broader strategy in which a military presence and the size of our military is only one component. And I will say that the other profound challenge in terms of increasing the size of the military as a more macro response to Russia and China is where we can find the money to pay for it. We're also contemplating a big infrastructure bill, potentially, increase in defense spending, but nonetheless, you still have those that will quite vigorously oppose any increase in the deficit, and I would add on top of all of that, a promised tax cut bigger than anything since Reagan. So I don't know how all that adds up, except that it really doesn't. Or if it does add it up, it adds up to a new level of deficit and debt, unlike anything we've seen. So if I had to guess, I would say there will be modest increases in military spending. And perhaps the more important way to push back will be in how we utilize those resources and where we utilize them.
So the lightning round in the couple minutes that we have left. Russia, what's the appropriate response? Should we hack them? ISIS, after they get driven out of Raqqa, stronger or weaker? And as a Democrat, will you work with the Republicans to make a Trump administration successful, or not cooperate?
Yes, weaker, and yes and no. If I've got the order wrong, I'm really in trouble. What should be the response to Russia? Well, they have paid no price for their hacking, and I think that unless they do, we'll see a lot more of this. They may have, fond hopes for President-elect Trump, and maybe those will be realized. Most likely they will not. And if they're not, then I think the Trump administration can expect more of the same. There will be hacks of Republican institutions. There will be dumping of documents embarrassing to the administration if the Russians find that useful. And unless we're prepared to push back, this is going to be just a new way of life. So what should our response be? the one thing that really gets Russian attention, frankly, has been the sanctions. And one of the reasons I'm very concerned about what I've heard the President-elect say is we shouldn't be talking about doing away with the sanctions over their invasion of their neighbor. We should be talking about adding to their sanctions, working with our partners in Europe who have been the subject of similar meddling, cyber meddling by Russia, so that we have a joint response. And I think there are ways that in a non-public way, we can demonstrate that they will also pay a price for this kind of hacking. I don't think that the response to a cyber attack always has to be a cyber response. In the case, for example, of North Korea, what I've been advocating was that we engage in a information campaign to let the people of North Korea better know what a terrible regime they have. That's something the North Koreans hate, and it would cause them to think twice about whether they want to hack into another U.S. company.
You're talking about forcefully, like live streaming reruns of Friends or something?
Well, I happen to like Friends, so that would be fine with me.
Apparently it's very useful in places like the Gulf to teach about American culture.
Is that right?
Who knew?
Yes, well, when the South Koreans turn on the loudspeakers, that drives the North Korean regime crazy. And in whatever ways we can disseminate information in North Korea and make it clear to the regime that this is going to be one of the responses, I think that has a deterrent impact and maybe less risky of cyber escalation than if we go and turn the lights out in Pyongyang, which are going out anyway.
And ISIS?
ISIS, I have to say I'm a little surprised at some of the doom and gloom I've heard from the IC publicly about the consequences of eliminating the caliphate, that it will cause a greater focus on external operations. Will it cause a greater focus on external operations? Yes. But is it still a phenomenally positive development to eliminate their caliphate? Absolutely. It eliminates the greatest draw for recruitment, this idea of the caliphate. It eliminates the safety and security of a large land space to plot and plan against us and all the resources they can derive from fees and taxation. So yes, it doesn't mean an end to ISIS, and in some respects it will mean an increased effort at lashing out. But is it absolutely necessary? It certainly is. So, I think that's what we'll look forward. We will be looking for an ISIS that resembles Al Qaeda in many more ways, as a non-state holding, non-ground holding global insurgency that is much more sophisticated in its use of social media. But I think that the destruction of the caliphate is a great positive.
And stealing 30 seconds back, you will work with the Republicans to make the Trump administration a success? Or will you do much as the GOP did over the past 8 years, finding ways to object to things?
Much more the former than the latter. Where we can find common ground, we should find it. We should move the country forward. The chairman, Devin Nunes, and I, this has been our guiding philosophy. We work together extraordinarily well. It has essentially been a nonpartisan committee. So in terms of the national security and intel work, I would hope that that would continue to be the focus of both parties. As President Obama says, we need the presidency successful. We need this president to be successful, especially on the issues that we're talking about here. That doesn't mean that in other areas, for example, on Russia policy, if they're moving a direction that I think is inimical to our national interests, I'm certainly going to fight them on it. And on a whole host of domestic issues, I'm going to fight them on that too. But I'm not going to take the view that I know some in the GOP leadership took when the President Obama was elected, that our central number one animating purpose is to defeat this president. And the national interest is secondary. The national interest is primary, and everything else is a secondary consideration.
Ranking Member Schiff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We live in interesting times.